Hello everyone, my name is John Vandermeer. I'm a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Michigan, also in the program in the environment. I'm here to give you a series of lectures, short lectures on the subject of agroecology. This is the first of those lectures. So if we're going to talk about agroecology, as when we talk about anything, we have to first of all decide, have to define what it is that we're talking about. So what do we mean when we say the word agroecology? Well, there are two ways of approaching this problem. We can approach it either from the point of view of what agroecology has been, where are its roots in the sort of long-term historical sequence, and second of all, we can talk about its contemporary function. First of all, let me talk about its historical roots. In speaking of agroecology's origins, we can think of it in terms of, I think, two different frameworks. We can think of it in terms of long-term sort of ancient history, and then we can think of it in terms of more modern history. Just a few words about where some of the concepts in agroecology must have come from. And this goes back to speculating about what happened at the origin of agriculture and even before the origins of agriculture. Agriculture originated somewhere about 10,000 years ago, something like that, more or less. Certainly the principles that initial agriculturalists used, especially the ecological principles, were the same sort of the ecological principles that are used or should be used today in agroecology. You can even go back further than that. In the next lecture, I am going to talk about the idea of ecosystems management. And ecosystems management goes back way before the origins of agriculture. So some of the principles are probably really deeply embedded in human culture. But to get to the more modern part, the more modern part of this actually comes from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created the world that we have today, obviously, and also created a huge expectation on the part of planners as to what agriculture was going to do in the context of the developing Industrial Revolution. There was a kind of a giddiness associated with the advances of the Industrial Revolution, all the machines based on steam power, etc., and the manufacturing styles that were coming into vogue. Really the modernization, or some would say the maturation of the capitalist system itself. And those who were thinking about agriculture, of course, they were very excited about getting agriculture into that whole process. And so you had sort of these expectations, some of which were pretty fanciful. Like this is one of my favorite right here, this sort of cartoon, which depicts agriculture, ancient and quote modern. And as you can see in this picture, what you have is the farmer. The farmer is running around inside of a big barn, but is it really a barn? Is it a barn, or is it actually a factory? As you can see, the barn has all these new agricultural implements inside of it, and there's the belts connected with this stationary steam engine, just like you have in all the factories, and the farmer's running around with an oil can, oiling all the machines inside of the factory. So you can pretty much see the idea here, and it's kind of a fanciful idea, of course, but the idea is that agriculture would soon be just like a factory, right? This is what is to be expected. It really didn't turn out to be that way, did it? One of the main reasons that it did not turn out to be that way actually was the intervention of the war years, especially World War II. When you stop to think about it, not stop to think about it, but when you realize what the history of it is, in World War II, it was a fact that more soldiers died from tropical diseases than died on the battlefield. And so there was a huge effort on the parts of the US military, the British military, and the German military also, to develop ways of dealing with the diseases. And these were mainly diseases, things like malaria, yellow fever, which were transmitted by insect vectors. And so there was the development of the idea that we should use insecticides, that is, develop chemicals that would kill these vectors of all of these diseases. And that was regarded as one of the major weapons in the war that was being fought against the fascists. And it was, to a great extent, it was a really successful, it was quite successful. Well, it was successful in that it certainly decreased the incidence of diseases amongst troops on the battlefield, and therefore was good. The problem arose then, not from the war itself. Pesticides were, as one might argue, pretty successful in the war effort itself, but the problem arose with peace. The threat of peace, as a matter of fact, caused the various big companies that were now producing all of the chemicals to ask the question is what was going to happen if peace broke out? What was going to happen to the demand for their products? This is what's called, frequently referred to in kind of the technical literature, as an underconsumption crisis as far as the producers of the chemicals were concerned. Now we're talking about big corporations which were producing those chemicals. So in this underconsumption crisis now, something needed to be done about that. Well, we now have a lot of historical information. A lot of studies have been done on this. Historians have gone through the archives of the very companies themselves, and it turns out that the companies were anticipating this outbreak of peace and this underconsumption crisis for quite a while. As a matter of fact, they were in the process of developing alternatives, narratives to be able to create a new kind of demand. And that new kind of demand became focused on getting not just soldiers, but to get everybody to use their products. And so what they did was they devised this idea that their products were basically like weapons in a war, and therefore agriculture was sort of like a war itself. And we had all sorts of propaganda, that's advertising, propaganda, so we had all sorts of propaganda to try to convince farmers and others that that basically what we were facing was another kind of battle, another kind of war, the war against the insects. So we had all sorts of advertisements like this one right here, like this one over here. These were obviously advertisements which were trying to convince people that the farmer now has to fight the fascists. Over on the right, that you can see the three main fascists there from Japan, Germany, and Italy, with their heads on bodies of insects, and then you have nozzles that are spraying at them. Are they spraying insecticide, or are they really cannons in warfare? And of course, it's not very subtle. The ambiguity is meant to be that case. And the one on the left, you can see, are the farmers there spraying with little spray guns, or are those machine guns, and are the things that are attacking them, are they Japanese warplanes, or are they insects in the field? Again, the confusion is intentional. So the idea was to try to convince farmers that, as a matter of fact, they were at war. They were at war with the insects. The insects were enemies, just as the fascists were. And just as we beat the fascists in World War II, we can beat the fascists with this new weapon called insecticides. And the project was certainly successful. We went from a situation where we had actual real people working in agriculture to a situation where we had real people working in agriculture, but they looked more like workers in agriculture, more like workers in a factory than farmers in the field. Now, the next phase of this history had to do with the expansion of the whole project into the rest of the world. At the end of World War II, the argument was that the Third World, what we called the Third World in those days, what we today usually refer to as the Global South, was in poverty, was underdeveloped, and one of the things that they needed to do was develop their agriculture so that they could become rich like the rest of us. So a program entitled the Green Revolution was devised to expand the industrial system into the rest of the world, especially the Global South. Now, the Green Revolution was very explicitly called the Green Revolution as a counterposition to what was sweeping the world at the time, and that was the Red Revolution. The Red Revolution was the socialist communist revolution that actually probably was more feared by the capitalists in the world than was justifiable at the time. So the Green Revolution, although it did, as a matter of fact, bring the industrial system to the rest of the world with all the attendant problems associated with pesticide poisoning, associated with the depletion of the soils, but also associated with the various socio-political problems that we still face today, problems of the distribution of land, where a very small fraction of, a small number of people have control over the vast majority of the land, and the small-scale farmers even though they're still very highly productive, have a very small amount of total agricultural land that's available to them. But it also was, let's not forget that the whole point of the Green Revolution was it was as a weapon in the war against the Red Revolution. Now, a major fly in the ointment was the publication of this book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Silent Spring was a heavily researched book and pointed out all the problems associated with the use of pesticides in agriculture and elsewhere. Rachel Carson pointed out what is obvious today, what we all know today, that pesticides actually kill lots of things. She was the first one to coin the word biocide as opposed to pesticide. We're not just killing pests, we're killing all the biology. Her work was very well researched, and you couldn't really fault it on any sort of scientific grounds. Nevertheless, the chemical industry, excuse me, the chemical industry spent a lot of money in lobbying efforts and lobbying the publishing company not to publish the book because it had obvious repercussions for the pesticide sales, obviously. The book was published, and many people regard the book as really the first salvo in the in the modern environmental movement. It was, there's no question about it. The modern environmental movement did have its origins with Silent Spring, there's no question about it. But I would argue also it was, in some sense, the first original statement about the need for agroecology. So yes, it did start earlier. It started with a variety of figures, 4 of whom I'm going to emphasize right now as being kind of the 4 pillars on which the modern agroecological movement stands. The first one was George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver was born a slave, but he managed to get himself an education, much of which was self-taught, and he became a professor at the Tuskegee Institute. Here you see him with in his laboratory, where he did research on various aspects of mainly plant physiology associated with agriculture. Here you see him teaching. He was a teacher. He's teaching a comparative anatomy class, obviously, right here. And here you see one of the most important things that he implemented was the idea of agricultural extension. He took these things that were called Jessup wagons at the time, mainly because of its funder, and he brought them out into the poor black farming communities to demonstrate to poor black farmers the new scientific advances that were happening that might aid in their agricultural production. Indeed, this made him, an instrumental in the idea of science, the idea of education, the idea of extension, all of that as all one big package. The next important character in the development of this story is Albert Howard. Albert Howard, he and his wife and her sister, who became his wife later on after his first wife died, that team, they were dispatched to India by Queen Victoria to bring to the Indians all the magic and the wonder and the advances that existed in the new modern industrial agricultural system. Well, when the Howard and Mathai team, they went to India, what they discovered was that Indian farmers already knew what they were doing. Indian farmers had ways of doing agriculture that extended way back, that they learned from their great-great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers. And basically what the Howard-Gabriel team did was they studied what the Indian farmers were doing as opposed to bringing the knowledge to the Indian farmers. They said, well, the Indian farmers are the ones who are bringing the knowledge to us. The book, An Agricultural Testament, that was written by Howard, probably with much aid from both Gabriel and Luis, is actually, reading it now, it has a certain modern flavor to it. It lays out all of the things that the Indian farmers were doing and lays out things that today we generally regard as rules of thumb as the way one should practice really responsible, sustainable agriculture. The next character is not really a character, it's not really a person, but it's an organization. This is the organization, they called themselves the Levelers or the True Levelers. They became known as the Diggers more popularly because they were all farmers who dug the earth. As has been the case throughout history, rural farmers, rural herders, rural fishers very frequently got together and they formed organizations. And when we had the development of unfair societies where you had unequal distribution of wealth, land, and power, people at the bottom frequently get together, they start talking with one another, and they start forming organizations to challenge political authority. In this case, the Levelers, or the Diggers, they were associated with the utilization of land. And the fact that the monarchy was using all of the land and the land was not available to the people. Their declaration, which this image is about, I'll read it to you. We give notice to everyone whom it concerns. We require and we resolve to take common land to be a livelihood for us and look upon you as equal with us, not above us, knowing very well that England, the land of our nativity, is to be a common treasury of livelihood to all. That was the statement of the Levelers, and that has become kind of a rallying cry, or the principle of the Levelers. Not that they are the only ones, or even perhaps the most important ones, but those kinds of organizations have existed ever since agriculture was invented and before, and it's no doubt that they will continue to exist. And my position is that that forms an essential piece of what we today call agroecology, that is political action. Finally, I'm going to go back to Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, in addition to writing the all-important book Silent Spring, she wrote two other books. Several other books, but two that I personally read when I was much younger and was overwhelmingly impressed by, talked about the seashore, talked about all of the ecological interactions that were happening in the seashore, and what they imparted to me was a sense of wonder about the way the natural world actually operates. It operates in a way that's exceedingly complex, but also beautiful, in a way it's really hard to explain the feeling that one gets when one walks in nature, feels the structure of nature, feels the romanticism of nature, shall we say. I don't mean to be too romantic about the whole thing, but there is a feeling that one gets when one looks at nature and sees structure in nature, sees things in nature that are all important. The idea of taking cues from nature directly, not from others' interpretations of nature, be they ecologists or traditional agriculturalists or rural organizations, but rather from nature itself. Nature has cues for us, and that's the kind of thing that Rachel Carson imparted in these other books that she wrote. At least that was the case for me. She was the first one to sort of give me the feeling that nature is a subject of ecological complexity. So there you have it. These are the four entities that I feel represent the four pillars of agroecology. You have Albert Howard, who told us that traditional agriculturalists know what they're doing, and they can tell us all sorts of things about how we should organize our agricultural systems. You have Rachel Carson, who told us that nature has messages for us also, and the direct observation of nature can lead us to certain kinds of understanding. You have George Washington Carver, who taught us about bringing science to the people, about educating people about science, not just the people in the universities where he was, but also the people who were out in the field, the agriculturalists, the same agriculturists that were there. And then we have the Diggers, who told us that political action is an essential component of agroecology. So with that history, we go back to the original question: what is agroecology? To me, that question is it's not something that you answer simply by saying agroecology is this, because agroecology actually is a platform. It's a platform of action and research and production, and that platform stands on four pillars. Those four pillars are science, traditional knowledge, nature, and political action. That is what ecology, that's what agroecology is, a platform that stands on these three pillars. The three pillars are not independent of one another. They're all intersecting, obviously. The science of ecology is the science that tries to understand that nature. The science of ecology is the science that tries to inform the political actors who are engaged in political action, et cetera, et cetera. There's an interaction amongst all of these four pillars, and most properly agroecology should be thought of as a sort of a conflagration of these four pillars. But the way to think about it, I think a useful way to think about it is as a platform of research and action which balances on these four pillars, which have their important historical antecedents. So that represents the, for me, the introduction to this lecture series, where we kind of defined what agroecology is, given its a certain historical context, and sort of laid out what the various subcomponents might be. And the series of lectures that I'm going to give, since my formal training is as a biologist and I am an ecologist, I'm going to emphasize the scientific ecology part of the whole thing. But as we go in the next lectures that I give, you'll see that I'm constantly using the other pillars of agroecology as input into my presentation. Thank you for listening.